I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here with Zacharias Sautner, Professor of Sustainable Finance and co-head of the Initiative in Sustainable Finance at the University of Zurich. And we're here to discuss the series Harald Walkate and I wrote for ECGI titled Does Sustainable Investing Work? And I should say that one of the academic review papers that Harald and I drew on heavily in producing the series was written by a team of authors at the University of Zurich. And Zach himself has published some of the most cited sustainable finance papers in top finance journals. And so I'm delighted, Zach, that you've agreed to have this conversation today. And perhaps before we start, you could briefly introduce the initiative in sustainable finance, which you launched not even a year ago, and which sounds very relevant.
Yeah, Tom, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today and share my views. And you're absolutely right. It's a new initiative. So I just moved 1.5 years ago, roughly, to Zurich. And what I noticed was that there was already a big cluster of scholars, professors, postdocs, PhD students, all working on sustainable finance topics. And basically, what we have tried to do is put all this under an umbrella to make it more visible to the outside with two goals. Goal one is to show that academics can really have impact through the work they do, that what they do is relevant for practitioners, investors, regulators. So we try to write policy briefs and outreach notes. And then second, use that also to do more fundraising because we do believe that much more work needs to be done in sustainable finance. And for that also, you need more professorships, you need more funding for data and other things. So we're also using that as a fundraising platform.
Mm. Well, I wish you every success with that. I mean, it's really my main focus now is on trying to create that bridge between academia and practice. So, I really wish you all the best with the initiative. I'd like to start with your reactions now to the series of articles that we put together, and we'll put a link to our original articles in the show notes. But in brief, we hypothesized that in order to have impact, sustainable investing needs to achieve three stages successfully, and we use the analogy of the three stages of a rocket required to get a satellite successfully into orbit. So first of all, in stage one, the investor's actions need to have some effect on the companies in which they invest. So, for example, divesting from a dirty coal company might increase its cost of capital. And then in stage two, managers at the company must respond to that effect and change what the company does so as to create an impact in the real economy. So, for example, managers might respond to the increased cost of capital by investing less, and so fewer dirty goods are produced. But then in stage three, the impact must persist and must not be unwound by the response of competitors and other actors. So, for example, competitors don't step in to increase production of dirty goods to offset the reduction at the first company. And when we reviewed the academic evidence, it suggested to us that conventional sustainable investing techniques struggled to make it through all three of these phases, which led us to conclude that sustainable investors wanting to have impact perhaps need to focus on perhaps somewhat more modest goals and focus less on achieving outcomes directly and more on influencing the circumstances in which good outcomes can occur, which could include through realistic engagement objectives or policy influence. So I'd like to start maybe with the positives in your reactions to our work. What do you think we got right?
So first of all, I think you make some important points, and making these points in a clear way and communicating them to the outside is critical because my concern is that we have built this huge high rise with ESG or sustainable finance on top, and I think there is a serious risk that this high rise is going to collapse, is not going to look like the vertical forests in Milan or these beautiful buildings nowadays in Singapore. And I think that risk is realistic because very often I have the feeling when talking to practitioners that they didn't get the fundamentals right. Not everyone, not everywhere, but many. And so therefore, I think there is a certain imperative for us academics to provide the right foundations. And I'll give a few examples in a
Mm,
moment. But I
mm,
see your work as really providing these foundations in an easy, accessible way. And relating to what you just said, My concern is if that high rise is going to collapse, we have destroyed, or the financial sector has destroyed once again trust.
Mm,
And this time, trust by millions of people, especially a younger generation,
mm,
that thought that by putting their money into sustainable finance products, ESG products,
mm,
they made the world a better place. But in fact, in many of the cases, that is not the case. And so therefore, I worry that if the high rise is going to collapse because of poor foundation, that
mm,
is going to undermine the entire transition that is ahead of us.
mm,
So let me explain a little bit what I mean, what you describe as these three stages. So I think first of all, in a sense, in the first stage, it's really critical to convey what the objective of sustainable investing is. What's the goal? Is it about value or is it about values? Right?
mm,
And that really matters.
mm,
Because I think a lot of the backlash that we've been seeing coming from the US relates to sustainable finance being about values,
mm,
being about, political issues,
mm,
implementing political views on companies that companies don't really want. I fully disagree. Based on, what you wrote, what I've done in my work, I'm deeply convinced that sustainable investing is about financial value. It's about risks. And making that distinction, value versus values, clear is important because if you are convinced that it's about risks, then no investor in the world, including the US,
mm,
can ignore sustainable investing because it is about risks. And every investor has to address these risks, be it climate risk, be it biodiversity risk.
mm,
And that brings me to a second point that you also very nicely make, which is we need to separate impact alignment from impact generation. A lot of the sustainable finance products that are being sold in the market suggest that the investors that buy these products generate impact.
mm, mm,
No, in the vast majority of cases, they're aligning with impact. They invest in companies that are already doing good things. So the
mm,
additionality, as it's called, is very, very limited.
mm.
And that's a problem, right? Because these investors believe by putting their money into these products, sometimes even paying higher fees, they change the world through the money into a better place. But often that is not the case.
Mm.
So therefore, making these fundamental points like you do is very, very important.
Can I just come back to you a little bit on this point about risks? Because and I completely agree with you. I mean, you'd have to be living under a rock not to see that there are sustainability risks that companies face and must address. Um, but it does seem to me that the industry has given very strong indications that actually they're having impact, and that is part of the way in which these products have been sold. And don't you think that actually a lot of kind of ordinary people, pension scheme beneficiaries or buyers of funds, actually part of what they're wanting to do is to feel that through their investments they're making the world a better place, and that isn't that the failure to meet that aspiration one of the problems that the industry is setting itself up for?
I'm fully with you, and that's where this disappointment will come from at some point, unless we also as academics or are pushing these points and are critical about what
Mm,
some parts of the industry are doing. So I'm fully with you. So I'm not saying that necessarily it's impossible to have a positive impact.
mm,
For example, if you think about risks and you believe that companies with large carbon emissions or negative impact on biodiversity are investment risks,
mm,
then as an investor, you can address these risks through engagement, right?
mm,
So you can have a positive impact in a sense through
mm,
the engagement you do. But the problem I see is that in most of the cases, I do believe we get it fundamentally wrong in how we think about making the world a better place. We think about it by saying that if you invest in this ESG fund that screens out all the dirty companies and invests
mm,
only in the good companies, you have a positive impact.
mm.
But as we just discussed, that
Yeah,
is not the case, right?
yeah,
You're just aligning with impact.
yeah.
So what you should do is that's why I said maybe we have it fundamentally wrong, is invest in the dirty companies.
Mm,
Don't exclude them because probably the cost of capital channel that you mentioned is
mm,
just too small
mm,
unless it's a big part of the market. So invest in the dirty companies and
mm,
then engage them,
mm,
right? My provocative statement would be the perfect ESG fund should
mm,
consist of the stocks on the target list of Climate Action 100 plus
mm,
or of Nature Action 100.
mm,
So these are all polluting, dirty
mm,
companies. But that's where you have the impact, right? If you go there and then actively try to change these companies,
mm,
that's where you can make a difference.
mm, mm. And maybe I'd like to come back and discuss
Mhm.
that a little bit more, but maybe just to finish up the discussion directly on the series that Harold and I wrote. What do you think we got wrong or maybe underemphasized?
I mean, I think it's very difficult, to say that you got something wrong. I think you make, great points. So let me say, a few additions that I
Mm,
think we all, not just in your report, but all of us in the profession need
mm,
to think a little bit more about. Point one, in my view, is the heavy reliance that we see on ESG ratings to evaluate ESG quality.
mm, mm,
Now, that's not just with us academics, right? It's also with practitioners. And especially if you go beyond the kind of small set of very big investors that, can have enough people to do the ESG analysis and, do the own internal modeling, right? So for probably 90% of the investors and for assessing 90% of the equity investments, it is based on ESG ratings.
mm,
So we have a very strong reliance in the industry, but also among academics. I mean, most papers nowadays on ESG, they have, some ESG ratings in there
mm,
that
mm,
are being used. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing to do, but I think we should, challenge a little bit
mm,
um, whether we can really rely on these ratings to evaluate ESG quality.
mm,
Because what I'm a little bit worried about is that we're going to wake up in a scenario like we had it after the big financial crisis, where many of us realize that these credit ratings
mm,
were biased, right?
mm,
We're not a unbiased assessment of the credit quality. They were biased because of conflicts of interest,
mm,
and that too many investors also blindly followed these
mm,
recommendations. And if it said AAA, it's a AAA. And so I do worry that we're gonna see something similar
mm,
on the ESG rating side. So I would say, but this is certainly also biased by my own work.
mm,
We need to have a more critical, challenging
mm,
dialogue
mm,
vis-a-vis ESG ratings
mm,
and the usage also of these ESG ratings, because very
mm,
often I fear
mm,
there's a bit of a cover your ass policy.
mm,
Right, with actually many investors, if you
mm,
think about it,
mm,
right? Even using different data providers and then just creating some average rating
mm, mm,
doesn't make sense at all because they have different methodologies, single,
mm,
double materiality, and
mm,
so on and so on. But,
mm,
but why they're still averaging it? Because they then can say to the regulators if something goes wrong, but we used three providers or four providers, we couldn't have done anything more. So that's one area
yeah.
I think where I would like to see a broader discussion. And then the second area that I'm increasingly worried about, but you're touching up on this
Mm,
as well, is that if you think about the regulatory approach that the EU in particular has taken, it's mostly based on disclosure and
mm,
transparency.
mm,
And having worked on this mandatory disclosure rules and so
mm,
on, I
mm,
can tell you, yeah, there are effects, but
mm,
under, many conditions.
mm,
And so
mm,
I think we are
yeah.
hoping for
And not
too
necessarily
much
that
of an
big,
effect.
right? As well. The
Yes,
effects might not be that great.
exactly. And so my concern is that we're all hoping that we're going to solve all,
Mm,
all, all the climate and biodiversity and other problems by asking for more transparency,
mm,
but that eventually maybe the effects are not as big. And
mm,
that there may actually also be a counterproductive effect. Because
mm,
if you nowadays talk to practitioners, and you have done this in your
mm,
survey too, what you hear is that the focus is nowadays mostly on legal aspects, on
mm, mm,
compliance.
mm.
Because there's so many rules
Yeah.
that in many cases even don't make sense at all.
Mm,
Right?
mm.
I'll just give an example. So there's now this new EU rule on fund names, right?
Yeah.
Under what conditions you're allowed to, put sustainable or
Mm,
ESG into a
mm,
fund name. And now I understand that, from a, consumer protection perspective, there are good reasons, to be careful. But what you see is now that the funds are looking at it and then they say, okay, so under what conditions am I allowed to still use my, ESG label?
mm,
And then they realize, only if I have X% in, these high ESG quality stocks. So how can I achieve that? I haven't achieved this at the moment based on my optimal portfolio allocation. Well, by buying some more green bonds. And now it's leading this regulation to
mm.
investors doing stuff just to fulfill the regulation
Yeah.
without necessarily that being motivated by, how do I make the world a better place?
Mm, mm,
Right? And so therefore, I think there is a big risk of overshooting. And
mm,
so how does that come into our discussion? I think I would also encourage all of us academics to have a somewhat more skeptical appraisal of all the regulation that is coming
mm,
and sometimes also putting warning signs up and saying, look, I'm interested in the same goal,
mm,
fighting climate change and biodiversity loss, but I don't think we're getting there. I don't think, let's say, that the taxonomy is going to solve the problem. We need other things that
mm,
we're not focusing enough on.
mm,
And one example, we can talk about it later, is facilitating engagement.
mm,
So
mm,
I want to have more rules that facilitate engagement. Because
mm,
as I said earlier, I deeply believe that this is a very
mm.
powerful mechanism to achieve positive impact.
You've thought about and studied the topic of sustainable finance very extensively from a number of perspectives. So how do you now think about the issue of what does and doesn't work in sustainable investing and what we should be hoping for from it?
I mean, what certainly doesn't work, even so it's often claimed, is that by doing sustainable investing, you have less risk and higher returns, right? I don't think this is going to work out,
Right.
in the long run, unless you believe that the basic fundamentals of finance are not going to hold.
Mm,
So therefore. We have to be critical when it comes to all kinds of claims that are
mm,
portraying ESG as being associated with superior returns on average. I
mm,
don't think it's gonna hold, right? If we believe that investing in a fund with low carbon emitters is a less risky investment, then we should be fine with having lower returns without that being a negative alpha or anything.
mm,
So what do I believe works based on the work that I've been doing
mm,
is, and that's going back to what we discussed earlier, is
mm.
actually engagement,
Yeah.
if you do it properly and at
Mm,
large scale. So
mm,
I've done some work where we got data from a big investor that
mm,
engages with its own money and on behalf of others.
mm,
And I can really say, there was no, requirement on only, publishing a result that is kind of supportive
mhm.
or anything like
Yeah.
this. Right? So we really looked at the data and we
Mm,
did find that from before to after the engagement,
mm,
relative to a control group, risks went down.
mm, mm,
And so that's not just, a piece of evidence that we have. There's also, other papers that show on the return side, that if you
mm,
do engagement, you change something positively, that the
mm,
valuation of the
mm,
firm goes up. Right? So that's something where there is a lot of potential, right?
mm.
Now, having said that, of course, we just, have one investor and,
Yeah.
with lots of assets, but still a small part of the market. And of
Mm,
course, we are all observing that, climate change continues, emissions are going
mm,
up
mm,
even further. So that means that there is still not enough engagement, right? And so that raises then the question, why is this not the case?
mm,
And I think it's in part because we haven't been pushing the message hard enough how important engagement is and how it can work. And that it's not about, the values, but the value dimension.
Mm,
And so that, of course, then raises the question, why, right? And, there are multiple reasons, but one reason is because a lot of investors worry about legal impediments, right? So that if you engage, especially as an investor coalition,
mm,
you face a legal risk because of acting in concert, because of, cartel competition laws in the US.
mm,
And so therefore, I fear that there's a legal environment, an institutional environment, in part also actually political environment, that puts a big threat towards this engagement channel, despite the fact that it has been
mm.
shown to be potentially quite effective.
But just then to respond on that engagement point, and I agree. I mean, I think we definitely drew that conclusion from the literature review that it's the most strongly evidenced channel
Yeah.
for actually creating real world impact.
Mm.
And your own paper on that looked at downside risk. Was consistent with a body of evidence on engagement,
Yeah.
which is supportive of it. But I suppose one of my concerns about it is that you do get over extrapolation from this idea that engagement works, because
Mhm.
my reading of most of the studies is that the impacts exist, but they're not sort of game changing in the context of the externality that we face.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they tend to be limited to engagement outcomes that are also financially successful or risk reducing for
Mhm.
the company itself. Whereas the problem that we have with a lot of these externalities is that actually it simply isn't profitable for companies to do this stuff. So it seems to me that engagement is only ever going to get us a small part of the way towards addressing these very serious externalities if we're really looking at it through a value lens. Is
I'm,
that fair, or do you
I
are
think
you more
I think
optimistic?
it's fair. I think it's fair. I would still say the part that we can achieve through the finance perspective is already quite significant. And
Right.
let me corroborate this with some work that I've been doing recently on
Mm.
lobbying.
Hmm.
So you talked about the externality on the climate side,
Hmm.
stemming from kind of unpriced carbon emissions.
Mm.
And so, what's the link to lobbying? Well, we all know the solution to the problem is a carbon tax, but it's not
Mm.
coming at a large
Mm.
scale.
Mm.
And one of the reasons is lobbying by companies.
Yeah.
And so, if you do engagement on lobbying, which by the way, investors increasingly are doing,
Yeah.
you can have a financial benefit from it because we show in our work on corporate climate lobbying that
Mm.
firms that do a lot of anti-climate lobbying constitute an investment risk because
Mm.
of reputation risk, because of
Mm.
them not transitioning fast enough. So
Mm.
if you engage on the topic, you have a financial benefit
Hmm.
because you reduce an investment risk and you address an externality problem because if you manage to get the big carbon emitters, which are the firms that do most of the anti-climate
Mm.
lobbying, reduce their lobbying efforts, you
Yeah.
have a higher probability of a carbon tax actually happening
Mm.
and the externality being priced. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying that that you're wrong. You're absolutely right. There are certain issues that are very hard to capture from this
Mm.
financially motivated
Mm.
engagement channel.
Mm.
But I think this channel is still going to give us quite some mileage.
Yeah, and I think what you've picked out there as well is an interesting way in which investors can use engagement to affect the policy
Right.
environment,
Right.
which in turn affects the incentives that the companies face. And I do think that that is a more fruitful area to look at than trying to sort of decarbonize one company at a time.
Yeah.
I mean, you've mentioned biodiversity a couple of times in the
Mhm.
discussion. I know it's an area where you're actively doing work at the
Mhm.
moment. Where do you think we are on investors understanding biodiversity risks as opposed to climate risks? Because it seems that we're quite a long way down the road of investors understanding climate risks, and there's decent
Yeah. Yeah.
evidence that it's showing up in various ways in
Yeah.
prices. But how would you contrast the situation with
Mhm.
biodiversity risk?
So that's a very good question. So I would say we are far behind in comparison, but there's lots of lessons learned from the climate debate that we
Mm,
can apply here now. And so the speed in which the market evolves, how the investor understanding evolves, is very different compared to the climate side.
Hmm.
Now, the challenge is the metrics that we
Mm.
use on the or have to use on
Mm.
the biodiversity side.
Mm.
It's not just, a simple metric like
Mm.
CO2,
It's much more
and
complicated, isn't it?
it's much more complicated, exactly. And I
Mm.
would say there's now data that provides us with a pretty good understanding of biodiversity impact by companies. So the impact and negative impact that companies have on biodiversity. So measures are available,
Mm.
like MSA, mean species abundance, or
Mm.
PDF. So they're available for investors, also at a pretty reasonable scale,
Mm.
and included also in some of the data packages nowadays by the big data providers. So that, is quite good. Even so, some biologists, if you talk to them, believe that these are very old metrics,
Mm.
that are not state of the art.
Mm.
Fine. Where we don't have good metrics yet is on the biodiversity
Mm.
dependency side. So to what extent companies are dependent
Mm.
on nature biodiversity.
Mm.
And it's not just the farmers and the bees, it's also, the tourist operators
Yeah.
that have a hotel on a coral reef that is endangered because the
Mm.
coral reef is dying. Or
Mm.
it's the pharmaceutical companies actually that need
Mm.
nature products for
Mm.
a lot of the medicines that
Mm.
that people are using.
Mm.
And so there, there's less progress yet. More work needs to be done.
Mm.
But I think it's happening.
Mm.
Now, suppose these measures are there, that's great. Then, from a risk management perspective, we know how to measure dependency and impact risks on the biodiversity side.
Mm.
But that's not yet solving the problem, right?
Mm.
Because what is still missing, and there's some work, by Caroline Flammer and
Mhm.
co-authors and others that goes in this direction, trying to see how we can actually do the monetization
Yeah.
of protecting, restoring biodiversity.
Mm. Mm.
So, think of it as following. If you reduce carbon emissions, you restore, the climate change problem. You can get these carbon certificates
Mhm.
that you can monetize by selling them to someone
Mhm.
else. If you
Mhm.
plant trees
Mhm.
that absorb carbon.
Mm.
We need something similar on the biodiversity side, but there is still very
Mm.
little work on how we can do this monetization.
Mm.
And so Caroline Flammer's paper, provides some foundations, but
Mm.
much more needs to be done
Mm.
along this direction. So these are some areas, and
Mm.
I understand some of this is more normative,
Mm.
where I think
Mm.
there's lots of space for us scholars to work on.
Mm. Just coming back to academia, then, what do you think the most sort of critical gaps are, or areas where the most high quality academic research is needed in order for us to kind of make progress on the role that sustainable investing should play?
Let me maybe make one general comment
Mm.
first. I have the feeling that there is a bit of an inflation of sustainable finance papers, ESG papers.
Hmm.
So, I'm also, pointing at myself probably. We should maybe write less papers on the topic and, have then, dig deeper in the fewer papers we write.
Right.
Because I feel, and again, you may include my word, I feel a bit that just too many people have jumped on this
Hmm.
literature, and you were using the kind of publicly available ESG ratings, and
Mm. Mm.
exchanging left-hand side variables, or using the same natural
Mm.
experiment for
Mm.
3 4
Mm.
different settings. So I think I think most of the progress can be made by generating new data, looking at new
Mm.
data,
Mm.
be it from surveys, be it from textual analysis, be it
Mm.
from actually going into companies and
Mm.
and seeing what they do,
Mm.
from talking to decision makers, right?
Mm.
I think something that I very deeply believe in, right? We should, just, talk to people rather than,
Mm.
create our parallel universe
Mm.
in
Mm.
academia. So I think that's broadly something. So we need
Yeah.
fewer papers, not because the problem is less, but because there is a concern, I think, also among editors that there are too many papers floating around that are not of the highest quality.
Mm.
Again, feel free to
Mm.
include my work. So I think that's one point. And in terms of future areas. So, we already talked about one point, monetization, biodiversity.
mm,
So how can that be done? And this
mm,
is very practically oriented, but I think the
mm,
practitioners look for guidance from academics. How can
mm,
we implement this
mm,
monetization?
mm,
A second part that I really worry about is that actually because of Trump, climate risks have not gone down because the probability of a tougher regulation being
mm,
unlikely, but rather the opposite. I think they have gone up. It's a little bit like if you think of an earthquake, tension builds up,
mm,
and the longer there is no move, the bigger the tension is, and once
mm,
there is an eruption, it's becoming very serious.
mm,
And so I think we need to critically try to see how we can assess the tail risks associated with, a Trump administration on the
mm,
climate side.
mhm,
The oil and gas companies, they've gone through the roof in terms of their valuations, but
mm,
just imagine what happens if at some point there is a hurricane and Mar-a-Lago is flooded
mm,
and
mm, mm,
Trump goes up and goes out and sees how his property is underwater. And given how jumpy he is in his views, suppose he's gonna go out there and says, "Oh, I finally understood
mm,
climate change is real. We're gonna introduce a carbon tax."
mm,
Now, that's not a 50% probability event,
mm,
but
mm,
it's also not it's also not 0%.
mm,
And so that's what I mean with tail risks, and
mm,
climate risks have actually maybe gone up.
mm,
I think the markets are not sufficiently pricing in that probability.
mm,
And I do worry if something like this happens, that the financial implications for financial stability are very significant.
mm, mm. Well, Zach, thanks very much. That was a really stimulating discussion. Thanks for spending the time to share your views today.
Thank you, Tom.